one of the years in American history, one of the great tumultuous years. You could list them, you know, maybe let's say 1776, 1861, 1886, 1919, 1946, 1968. These are years of explosive social upheaval in American history. And and it's a big crackdown on labor, because labor's been getting very powerful and very successful in the 1880s. And so labor parties form all across the country. But the one that everybody pays attention to, of course, is in New York City, the United Labor Party. They know that they've got to pick a person that can win. They've run symbolic labor candidates that have gotten 500 votes and have caused all kinds of internal dissension. So they choose George because he's kind of the perfect package. He's a middle-class guy, he's an intellectual, but he holds a Knights of Labor Union card. They know that he struggled as a young man, so his kind of biography is out there. And he seems to be the right guy. And they nominate him, and he plays a little hard to get, but all that works in his favor, and this gets tremendous national and ultimately international coverage. Karl Marx is writing to people about it, saying, what's going on in America? Who's this guy Henry George? I mean, it's really getting a lot of attention. His opponents in the election are Abram Hewitt, who was in his own way, kind of an early progressive industrialist and a congressman, and this guy, Theodore Roosevelt, who was not as well known as we would imagine. He was an up-and-comer at this point. And so these are the two established party candidates. George knows he's got no money, he has no experience. None of the people on his campaign have any experience either, but they throw out the rule book. And you can see from this one image, George does what's never been done before. Runs a populist candidacy where he's out on the streets all night long, every night leading up to election, stopping at as many as 20 places. And they call this the tailboard campaign, because he's on the back of a wagon giving his speeches to the masses, and there's tremendous growing enthusiasm. And as I detail in the book, it's clear Tammany Hall, which is the one backing Abram Hewitt, the Democratic candidate, is panicked because they realize, you know, those are their voters. The poor working class people are being drawn into this new third party, the United Labor Party, and they pull out the stops to kind of stymie that. On election day, George stuns certainly New York City, arguably the nation, and certain people around the world are stunned. He doesn't win, but he comes close. And if you look, you know, he beats Theodore Roosevelt. And the two combined votes between George and Roosevelt, they were the two progressive candidates, certainly compared to Hewitt. So clearly something was happening. And a lot of people walked out of that election, including George, saying, this is not a defeat. This is a sort of a defeat, but it's the stepping stone to something much greater. In fact, he compares it to Bunker Hill. Next year, we're going to form a national labor party, and then we're going to have, you know, this is going to be the first of a glorious people's party. And he's sort of anticipating what it ultimately is formed, unconnected to him directly, the progressives and the People's Party. So, but it all falls apart, as these stories often do. There's infighting, there's dissension, it's a big coalition of socialists and middle-class reformers, and I go into detail about how and why it all seems to collapse. George runs for Secretary of State of New York the next year, which everybody thinks it's the only important election, you know, office that's up for election in New York State, and he gets a fraction of the votes that he got in just New York City. So things have really, really fallen apart. But that's not the end of the George story. George himself will continue to write. He'll still have a big following. But more and more after 1886, 1887, people that were influenced by him begin to, you know, pick up his ideas, pick up, if not his direct ideas, the essence of his ideas and the essence of his call to action to save the American experiment, the American Republican experiment. And George dies 10 years later in 1897. But by that point, there are legions of George followers, including Mr. Lincoln, who by then had begun to read Progress and Poverty and see in it, even, you know, almost 30 years after, or almost 20 years after the book was originally published, some ideas and things that really called out to him and really kind of changed his life. And, you know, the Progress and Poverty will continue to be reissued. I had my father, when he found out that I was writing about Henry George, said, you know, I think your grandfather read Progress and Poverty in the 1930s, and eventually dug out the book. Now, my grandfather had a fifth grade education, came from Ireland, but was a real classic, like a self-taught guy. And so the Schalkenbach Foundation, which is one of the many George foundations, issued a new edition of Progress and Poverty in the midst of the Great Depression, no coincidence. And my grandfather bought it and read it. There's little notations in the margin. It's a very, I took that as a good sign. But since that time, George has come in, I wouldn't say in and out of favor, but you could track him in some ways over the decades, how often he's referenced in magazine articles and newspaper articles and books and so forth. And there definitely seems to be an uptick. I always say, and I have no evidence to prove this, but I've written a U.S. history textbook, so I've read a lot of U.S. history textbooks. And if you go back into the 70s, George might get a sentence, and now George seems to be getting half a paragraph. He certainly does in my book, and I think that that's kind of an interesting way of measuring not only the way history has evolved, and the way we tell our stories and things, but also where people are recognizing he wasn't this godlike figure, but the way he was able to kind of fix on the true problem of the day, and to get people to think about it, and how that influence carried forward into the progressive era is certainly worth noting. And so George, if we are living in a second Gilded Age, what does George have to speak to us about today? Well, I just isolate a couple of things here. One is the way he describes the problem of inequality, as I noted at the beginning, is almost identical in terms of basic terms that Thomas Piketty and other, Stiglitz and others have pointed out, that inequality is something that will not self-correct, particularly in the modern era. It's something that will pull us down and cause widespread suffering and widespread social disruption. And one of my favorite points about Henry George, especially in these days of popularity of libertarianism and Ayn Rand books selling in huge copies, we forget that that individualism is not the only American ideal, right? That individualism has always coexisted uneasily and in competition with notions of the common good. The founding fathers believed in the common good, right? The Constitution says, right in the very beginning, says, to promote the general welfare. There's a lot of things in our Republican heritage, back to the founders, that talks about we have to attend to the common good. And so these things need to be somehow in balance. And by the Gilded Age, it was all individualism, it was all laissez-faire, it was all what you individually could do, and private property, absolute rights to private property were the dominant notion. And George very evocatively points out in this book and in his whole career that we are made, that we need to be attentive to the common good, the things that hold us together, the fact that, sure, let's say public schools, for example. Public schooling is not in the Constitution. But at some point in American history, somebody said, it'd be a really good idea to have free public education for everybody. It'll cost us a little bit of money. It'll cost us a little bit of liberty and a little bit of, individualism and so forth. But everybody's going to benefit from an educated, literate, civilized, populace. So that's why we've done that. So that notion of the common good, I think, is a lost virtue. And I think one that we really need to be reminded about in this day of kind of rampant celebration of individualism. And right on the heels of that, how do we solve our problems? Again, that libertarian notion is problems solve themselves. And the government is the problem. The government can only do wrong. The government, and I'm not saying government does everything right, but Henry George said, look, the government is us. And in a democracy, we can decide if we want public schools, if we want taxation to take this particular form, if we want public parks, if we want to improve public health and so forth. We can decide as a democracy. And when the only way that happens is through the instruments of government on some level, if only to build infrastructure and to do those things. And the market itself, as wondrous as it is in some ways a myth, this idea that the market is this thing that just does things apart from the actions of state and local and federal government. But the government does play a role. Because of the focus of your place, it's really worth pointing out, being here at the Lincoln Institute, that while land value taxation still has merit, something that I think is probably the average person doesn't think about property taxes and things other than they see them connected to public schools, and that's really in a lot of ways where the controversy seems to arise in the public square. But how we tax ourselves, I guess at this point we seem to be arguing about if we tax ourselves, but how we tax ourselves is an exceedingly important thing as we move into the 21st century and try to tackle some of these problems. So I'm going to put up my original screen there and say thank you very much for listening, and turn things over to questions if you have any.